I was sent the link to a video where a chap was discussing a very interesting technicality in the law with respect to council tax, specifically whether you are required to notify the local authority of your residence in the property. And I have to say, he's right, to a degree, because if you know me well enough by now, you will know that it's never quite as simple as that. So welcome back, and if you're new to me, I'm a barrister who helps you understand law. Now, this case is really interesting because it's a criminal case that went to the Court of Appeal on fraud charges, and it discussed the obligation to notify the local authority of your residence in the property. Very briefly speaking, somebody was charged with many counts of fraud by false representation. The case and the story, in very simple terms, was as follows. The prosecution's case was that the defendant had applied for single person's discount in respect of council tax, and then shortly afterwards rang the council tax department for housing to say that she'd moved out and gave a forwarding address. A new council tax account was set up by the local authority in the name of the tenant, but the prosecution's case was that, in fact, the defendant remained in the property and made several false representations to the local authority, which the prosecution said amounted to fraud. All of which, of course, because the prosecution said that she'd provided false information to the local authority in order to avoid paying council tax. This was clearly contrary to the Fraud Act of 2006. In fact, there were 6 counts altogether, and all of counts 1 to 5 were pleaded as fraud by false representation, contrary to sections 1 and 2 of the Fraud Act of 2006. And there was no issue with any of these because they were fairly straightforward in that she'd made these representations to the local authority, they were declared to be false to make a gain, and therefore it was fraud. However, there was an issue taken with count 6, which read as follows. The statement of offence was fraud by failing to disclose, contrary to sections 1 and 3 of the Fraud Act 2006. The particulars of this offence was that the defendant had committed fraud in that she had dishonestly failed to disclose the local authority that she lived at the address, which she was under a legal duty to disclose, intending to make a gain for herself or a loss to another, namely by avoiding to have to pay council tax. Now, the question of law, of course, for determination by the Court of Appeal was whether or not there was a legal duty imposed on the resident of a property to inform the local authority that they were living there so that the local authority could charge them with council tax. However, just jumping back to the video that I was sent for just a moment so that it slots into this case and my discussion here, the video was of a chap calling the local authority and recorded the call, and he was telling them about this case with the conclusion that A, he didn't have to tell the local authority that was living there, and therefore B, that he didn't have to pay them council tax. And he also went on to say other things such as acts and legislation are not law, which is not true, but I'll leave that aside for the purposes of this video. So interestingly, just jumping to the conclusion of this appeal case here, the court said that it was quite wrong to equate the liability to pay council tax with a liability to notify. However, as I said, and with respect, to take this case and then conclude that you don't have to pay council tax is quite misconceived. You see, the duty to pay council tax is derived under Section 6 of the Local Government Finance Act 1992, specifically subsections 1 and 2, which provides that the person liable to pay council tax is the person in respect of any chargeable dwelling and falls within the first paragraph of subsection 2. And subsection 2 provides that a person falls within this subsection in relation to any chargeable dwelling if on any day he is A, a resident of the dwelling and has a freehold interest in it. Then it goes to B, which is where he is a resident and has a leasehold in the property. He's both a resident and a statutory, either secure or introductory tenant of the whole or part of the dwelling. And D, a resident with a contractual license to occupy the whole or part of the dwelling. E is such a resident. Or F, and finally, the owner of the dwelling. So if it's completely empty and no one's living there, it still falls down to the owner of the dwelling. That is the person that is liable to pay the council tax. But now let's look at the obligation to notify the local authority about who is living in the dwelling. Now, as the Court of Appeal said, and the reason I said that the chap in the video is right to an extent, is that the Court of Appeal confirmed that the obligation to pay does not equate or imply an obligation to notify the local authority. In other words, there's no legal obligation to tell the local authority that you're living in the dwelling. However, as always, it's never that simple. If we look at the Council Tax Administration and Enforcement Regulations of 1992, which is effectively where the local authority gets the powers to enforce and collect council tax, and we look to Regulation 3, which is titled Information from Residents, a person who appears to a billing authority to be resident, owner, or managing agent of a particular dwelling shall supply the authority such information as fulfills the following conditions. A, that it's in the possession or control of that person. B, the authority requests by notice given in writing the person concerned to supply it. C, it is requested by the authority for the purposes of identifying the person who, in respect of any period specified in the notice, is the liable person in relation to the dwelling. In other words, there is an obligation on any person who it appears to the local authority to be the resident, the owner, or the managing agent of any particular dwelling, to give them the information as to who is in control and possession, or who is resident within the property, and therefore the person liable under that hierarchy that I've just discussed to pay the council tax. So it's a little bit of a technicality in the law, in that if you move into a dwelling, you don't have to tell the local authority that you are living there. However, if the local authority asks you, because you appear to be resident, owner, or managing agent of that property, or they ask the managing agent or the owner if you are just a tenant and a resident and so on, then that person must provide that information to the local authority. And under subsection 2, a person on whom this notice is served must provide that information within 21 days, beginning on the day the notice was served. So as I said, a little bit of a technicality, which makes the chap in the video right in a very narrow sense, in that a person does not have an obligation to notify the local authority that you are living there. But I think it's a reasonable guess to say that in almost all circumstances, the local authority is going to send out a notice to say who is living here. Maybe that will be to the owner, the agent, or just to the property, to say whoever is resident in that property. And it would be no good to say that just because it's not naming you in that notice that it doesn't apply to you. The legislation, these regulations are quite clear in that if you are resident in the property, the owner of the property, or the managing agent of that particular dwelling, then you will be the person who is required to provide that information as to who is the person liable to pay the council tax, and then you are liable to pay the council tax. So if anyone sees this video and sees that the officer who, with respect to the officer of the local authority who is probably not legally trained, certainly not, I suggest, to the extent necessary to explain what I've just explained to you, but the local authority has a procedure, and the procedure is that they will send out a notice requesting information as to who's living in the property, and any of those people are required to provide it. But anyway, that's about it without making this an hour-long video. I hope you found that interesting for another legal technicality, but as always, don't just watch some of these videos and be tempted to think that it's all correct, because it's almost never quite that simple. So in the meantime, please smash that like button and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.